The golden sun stretched its fingers across the horizon, bathing the vast 1,700-acre farmland in a warm glow. Birds chirped in harmony, and the scent of fresh soil filled the air. For Jacob Carter, this land wasn't just dirt and crops. It was his heritage, his bloodline, his entire world. His great-grandfather had tilled this soil with his bare hands. His father had expanded it, built irrigation systems, and turned it into the most thriving farmland in the county. Jacob had done more. He made a lifeline for the community, supplying fresh produce to local markets, schools, and even the HOA's fancy country club. But on this particular morning, something felt off. The wind carried a strange chill, a whisper of impending change. As he stood by his old wooden fence, sipping his coffee, he noticed something unusual. A group of HOA officials standing near his property line, pointing and whispering. His gut twisted. Jacob had always kept his distance from the HOA, never needing their approval, never wanting their interference. His land was outside their jurisdiction, or so he thought. That night, as he sat on his porch watching the fireflies dance, he had no idea. His entire world was about to be turned upside down. For months, Jacob had ignored the HOA's constant offers to purchase his land. Every few weeks, a new letter would arrive, each one more aggressive than the last. We'd love to discuss a mutually beneficial sale. Your land is valuable, and we'd like to make an offer. This is your final notice before further action is considered. He tossed him the fire pit, without a second thought. His land was not for sale. What Jacob didn't realize was that the HOA wasn't just asking anymore, they were plotting. A secret meeting was held at the HOA president's estate. A room full of men and women in expensive suits sat around a long table, sipping fine wine, discussing Jacob's land as if it already belonged to them. "He won't sell," one man sneered. "We make him sell." A woman in a silk blouse smirked. "Oh, he won't have a choice. I've already pulled the paperwork. Legally, he's in for a rude awakening." Laughter filled the room. Plans were set in motion. And Jacob? He had no idea his farm was already being stolen from beneath him. It happened on a crisp Monday morning. Jacob was up at dawn, feeding the animals, when he saw a black SUV barreling down his dirt road. The door swung open. A man in a pressed suit stepped out, holding a thick envelope. "Mr. Carter?" Jacob wiped his hands on his jeans. "Depends. Who's asking?" The man smirked. "Mr. Carter, as of this morning, this property is no longer yours." Silence. Jacob's heartbeat thundered in his ears. "Excuse me." The man handed him the envelope. Jacob's calloused hands trembled as he tore it open. Inside was a legal notice, a final sale agreement with a forged signature. His signature. A cold dread slithered down his spine. "This is a mistake," Jacob growled. "I never signed this." The man shrugged. "The county records say otherwise. The land has been sold. You have 30 days to vacate." Jacob's world spun. His home, his family's land. His life gone? His hands clenched into fists. Not without a fight. Jacob stormed into town, his boots pounding against the pavement as he headed straight to the county office. The clerk, a young woman with kind eyes, took one look at him and sighed. "You're not the first, Mr. Carter." His stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" She slid a folder across the counter. Inside were dozens of similar cases. Farmers, homeowners, all forced out of properties under mysterious circumstances. They used legal loopholes, fake signatures, rigged votes. Once the paperwork goes through, it's almost impossible to reverse. Jacob gritted his teeth. There has to be a way. She hesitated, then leaned in. The only way to beat them is to hit them where it hurts. Jacob narrowed his eyes. And where would that be? A slow smile crossed her lips. Their wallets. That night, Jacob sat in his barn, thinking. If the HOA had done this to him, how many others had suffered in silence? He made some calls. By morning, 20 people had gathered in his field. Elderly couples, young families, struggling business owners. Every single one had a story. They took our home. They forced us out. They threatened our family. Jacob's blood boiled. These weren't just victims. These were his neighbors, his people. And then an idea struck him. He wasn't just a farmer. He was a supplier. For years, he had provided food for the HOA's high-end grocery stores, the luxurious clubhouse, even the overpriced cafes where they held their elite meetings. What if he stopped? Jacob turned to the group, his voice steady and full of purpose. They took from us, he said. Now it's time we take something back. The plan was simple. Cut them off. No fresh produce. No deliveries. No supplies. Within weeks, the HOA would be begging for mercy. And that was just the beginning. Jacob knew that a fight against injustice required more than anger. It required strategy. The HOA had power, money, and legal loopholes. But they had one major weakness. They relied on him for food. For years, his farmland had been the backbone of the HOA's extravagant lifestyle. The high-end grocery stores, the expensive country club, even the catered HOA board meetings, all stocked with fresh produce from his farm. And now, not anymore. Jacob made a call to his suppliers, stopping all shipments immediately. At first, the HOA didn't notice. They continued their usual business, hosting lavish brunches, boasting about their community's elite status. Then the complaints started. Why are the shelves empty? Why is the country club out of fresh fruit? Why is there no farm-to-table menu this week? By the end of the first week, the HOA board was in full panic mode. The community prided itself on fresh, organic food, and now it was all gone. But Jacob wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning. The HOA wasn't going to go down without a fight. A week after Jacob cut them off, HOA President Richard Monroe, a man who had built his power on intimidation and underhanded deals, stormed onto Jacob's property with a legal team and a security detail. He didn't knock. He didn't ask. He demanded. You are in violation of the new community farming ordinance, Monroe sneered, handing Jacob a thick stack of paperwork. If you refuse to supply the HOA, you'll be fined $50,000 for contract breach. Jacob leaned against his porch railing, completely unfazed. You must think I'm stupid, Monroe, Jacob said, flipping to the pages. There is no contract. You stole my land, and now you expect me to keep feeding you. Monroe's face turned red. You listen to me, Carter, he hissed. If you don't start deliveries again, You'll what? Jacob interrupted, stepping closer. Take my farm? Oh, wait, you already tried that. Monroe's jaw clenched. The HOA had always relied on fear to control people. But Jacob wasn't afraid, and that terrified them. Jacob wasn't the only one tired of the HOA's corruption. For years, the board had abused homeowners with unfair fees, forced evictions, and ridiculous regulations. The moment Jacob stood up to them, it was like a spark igniting dry grass. The community began to fight back. First, the local grocery store owners joined Jacob's strike, refusing to stock HOA-approved products. Then, local contractors refused to work on HOA-funded projects. Within weeks, the entire town had turned against them. One by one, homeowners started digging into their contracts, uncovering decades of fraudulent fines and illegal evictions. A retired lawyer named Margaret Hensley, who had lived in the HOA community for over 20 years, began gathering evidence. And what they found, it was worse than anyone imagined. The HOA wasn't just stealing land. They had embezzled millions. Jacob received a late-night call from Margaret. You need to come over, she whispered. Now. Jacob arrived at her house to find a mountain of documents spread across her dining table. This, Margaret said, tapping a confidential HOA ledger, is proof that they've been funneling money into private offshore accounts for the past 15 years. Jacob scanned the numbers. His stomach twisted. Millions of dollars have been stolen from homeowners under fake fines, fraudulent property seizures, and inflated HOA fees. The HOA wasn't just corrupt. It was a criminal empire. And the worst part? The county officials were in on it. Monroe and his board had been bribing local government employees to keep everything under wraps. Jacob clenched his fists. This wasn't just about his farm anymore. This was about justice. Jacob knew that fighting the HOA in court alone wouldn't be enough. They had power. They had money, but they had one major weakness. They had broken federal laws. Using the documents Margaret had gathered, Jacob contacted a friend at the FBI. Within days, a federal task force was quietly assembled. For weeks, the HOA board carried on as if nothing was wrong, hosting meetings, collecting illegal fines, and bullying homeowners. Then one morning, it all came crashing down. Black SUVs pulled up in front of the HOA office. FBI agents stormed in. Officers slapped handcuffs on Monroe and his board members before they even knew what hit them. The town watched as the corrupt officials were hauled away, one by one. And Jacob? He stood at the edge of his farmland, watching the scene unfold, a slow smile crossing his face. Justice had finally arrived, but the story wasn't over yet, because now it was time to reclaim what was his. Monroe and the HOA board members thought they were untouchable. For years, they had bullied homeowners, stolen land, and drained people's savings with fake fees and illegal fines. But now, they were facing federal charges. The day after the FBI raid, the town was buzzing with shock and excitement. People gathered in the town square, reading the headlines out loud. FBI uncovers multi-million-dollar HOA fraud scheme. Illegal land seizures and bribery exposed in shocking HOA scandal. The once feared board members were now criminals in handcuffs. Jacob stood at the edge of his farm, watching the news van set up. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to breathe, but it wasn't over. There was one final battle left to fight, because while the HOA board was being dragged through the legal system, Jacob's land was still not officially his again, and he would do whatever it took to reclaim it. The courtroom was packed. Farmers, homeowners, reporters, even some of the same people who once sided with the HOA, now desperate to see justice. Monroe sat at the defendant's table, looking defeated. His once perfect suit was wrinkled, his smug arrogance gone. Jacob, however, stood tall. His lawyer, Margaret, took center stage, unveiling the evidence piece by piece. Falsified land deeds with forged signatures. Bank records showing money being funneled to secret accounts. Emails and recorded calls proving the HOA knowingly broke the law. When it was Monroe's turn to speak, he tried one last desperate move. "This is a misunderstanding," he stammered. "We were only acting in the best interest of the community." Margaret didn't even flinch. "Really?" she asked, sliding a document onto the judge's desk. "Then why does this email show you personally approving the sale of Jacob Carter's land, despite knowing it was illegally obtained?" The room went silent. Monroe turned pale. And then the judge's gavel slammed down. "Not only is the HOA guilty of fraud and illegal property seizure," the judge announced, "but I am ordering an immediate return of all stolen property, including Mr. Carter's 1,700 acres of farmland." Jacob exhaled. It was over. He had won. But what happened next? That was something even he hadn't expected. With Monroe and the corrupt HOA board removed from power, a new temporary leadership was put in place. And the first thing they did? They apologized. Many of the remaining HOA members, including residents who had blindly followed Monroe's orders, stepped forward, ashamed of what had happened. Jacob wasn't expecting that. One elderly woman, Mrs. Calloway, approached him with tears in her eyes. "I had no idea how deep the corruption ran," she said. "We were all told you were a problem, but now I see the truth. You weren't the problem. Monroe was." Jacob studied the faces of the people around him. Some of them had supported the HOA's actions. Some had ignored the warning signs. But now, they had learned their lesson. And Jacob, he had a decision to make. Forgive them or let resentment take over. Instead of holding on to anger, Jacob did something different. He rebuilt. Not just his farm, but the relationship between the town and the community. With his land officially restored, Jacob set new boundaries. He worked with the newly elected HOA board, not to be controlled, but to make sure no one else suffered what he did. A new law was passed ensuring that no HOA could ever seize farmland without explicit owner consent. But the biggest change? Jacob opened his farm to the public. Instead of only selling produce to large distributors, he started a weekly farmers market. The same people who once turned a blind eye were now coming to buy his food, learning firsthand about where it came from. And little by little, the damage caused by Monroe's corruption began to heal. 6 months later, Jacob stood at the edge of his field, watching the sun rise over his 1,700 acres of reclaimed land. His farm was thriving again. His workers had returned. And the town? It had changed forever. Monroe and the corrupt HOA officials were serving time behind bars. The fraudulent HOA fees were reversed, saving families thousands of dollars. And most importantly, people had learned the value of standing up for what's right. As Jacob walked across his land, his neighbor, Tom, pulled up in his truck. "You know," Tom said, tipping his hat, "Monroe's got to be losing his mind watching you win." Jacob chuckled. "Yeah," he said, looking across his field. "But the best revenge?" He paused, watching a group of children run through the fields, laughing and playing. "It isn't about getting even." He smiled. "It's about getting better."